My mother family had moved to Oregon. So my grandma, Margaret Landers, and Michael Landers raised their family, who was Aunt Dorothy and my mother Ruth. There was another son, Robert, who died as an infant, and there were twins who died as infants. There was Ginny, Virginia, and there was Jack. And as far as I know, they always lived on West 95th Street, but maybe not, I don't know. But so that house stayed in the family because Dorothy and Emmett, when we moved out and Dorothy and Emmett moved back in with their 4 girls, they were there all the way through the late 1960s. So that family home, and we had somebody from our family in that home for probably 80 years, yeah. From my dad's family would be Edward Francis the first, and his wife, Ellen Donovan. And they were from the East Coast. And they ended up in Ohio because my grandpa, Morrill, worked for the Bell system. And this was back at the turn of the century when they were putting in telephone lines. It was a big thing. And they ended up in Springfield, Illinois, around the corner from Abraham Lincoln's law practice. So if you go to see Abraham Lincoln's law office, the old family home where Aunt Eleanor and Edward Francis II and Paul were born is now the visitor center in Springfield, Illinois. From Springfield, Illinois, they came to Columbus. And Eleanor went to Yale, and Edward, my dad, went to Case Western Reserve, and Uncle Paul went to Penn State. While my father was in Cleveland, he met my mother. They met at a party with some of my mother's cousins knew some of these college boys. And that's how he met my mother, yes. They were married in Cleveland, and after my father graduated from college, and my dad went to work for the telephone company, climbing poles and doing all the things that you do as a lineman. And because the Depression came in 1929, right after he graduated, my mother had very poor health. The Depression came, my father lost his job. He finally found a job pumping gas at a gas station for the Standard Oil of Ohio. And that was 1930 and 31. And my mother was bedridden at the time. She finally was able to learn to walk with crutches. And don't you know, she got pregnant and went to the hospital and had my brother walking with crutches. And I remember the crutches were still there at home. Even when we moved later on, the crutches went with us. When I came along 2 years later, she was walking with 2 canes There were family stories. She fell playing tennis and injured her back. She had polio. She had an attack of arthritis. I don't know. She always had a bad back, though. Always did. We lived in the family house on West 95th Street in Cleveland. It had been my grandparents' home. My grandmother died when my mother was 16. And so Aunt Dorothy and my mother became head of the household. Their dad was a fireman. That's my grandpa. Dorothy and my mother used to have to walk down to the corner tavern, bring his beer home in a bucket. And I remember Friday nights, we all went to the tavern and had fish. And I can remember sitting down there in the family room. There was the bar, but then there was a family room. Yes, I remember going down to the same bar. But yes, Grandpa Landers, Michael Landers. And then Ginny and Uncle Jack were much younger. My parents were married, and we lived in the, I didn't know this, but I got told it. We lived in the top half of a double on Bays Avenue, while Aunt Dorothy stayed with my grandpa. And then Dorothy and Emmett, her husband, and her first two daughters moved to Batavia, New York. So we moved to the family home on West 95th Street to take care of my grandfather. And we were there. My grandfather died in 1936, but we stayed in the family home. And then Aunt Dorothy came back from Batavia. She now had 4 girls. And my mom and dad built a house out in Fairview, which is a suburb of Cleveland. It was way out in the country. It was 1939, 1940. And I was coming up on 4, and I do remember moving into that house. So my brother and I, and my mom and dad, and Ginny, because my dad was her guardian. She was in college at that time. And there we are out in the country. Ginny was in college, so she came and went. And then World War II started. She joined the Navy. Probably my earliest memory of my brother is when we lived on West 95th Street. And we had a coal furnace. And we weren't supposed to be down in the basement where the coal cellar was, but we were there. And a big, big furnace. The coal furnaces were huge. And, you know, we were always in trouble. But the best memory I have is when we moved to Fairview, because it was out in the country, I was the only girl in the neighborhood. So I just ran with all the other boys. And we lived across the street from a big park. And in those days, I was 4 years old. And so he was 6. And my mom would pack our lunch and we'd leave for the day. And we would play in the park, and just, there was a amusement park that was all the way through on the back side of that city park. And can you imagine, here I was 4 and he was 6, and all the other little boys were probably 6, 7, 8 years old. We would climb the hill and sneak into the amusement park. We had no money. But we just thought we were so adventuresome. Learned to ride bikes. In those days, nobody came and plowed your streets in the wintertime because we were basically out in an area that wasn't city. And we played in the snow. Every night when my dad would get home, if there was snow on the streets, we would hook our sleds onto the back of his car and pull us through the streets. And in those days, cars had running boards, and we were always able to ride on the running boards. When the war started, we couldn't use the car because it was gas rationing. So my dad walked to the bus stop, and my brother and I would ride our bicycles to the grocery store to get groceries. It's about 4 blocks away. We spent all our time outside. And of course, since it was the war, I remember every week we would go up to the Pure Oil station and get that week's picture of the enemy airplanes on little postcards. And we were supposed to learn how to recognize the enemy planes if they flew over. And we had a whole collection of postcards with silhouettes of planes on them. We were very serious about it. Because there was gas rationing, we didn't get to see our relatives very much because nobody could drive any place that wasn't emergencies. What did we do? We played soldiers a lot because it was the war. This will make everybody shiver. We made lead soldiers. You'd heat up the lead and pour them into rubber molds, and that's where we did a lot of that when we lived in Fairview. That's how come we had the soldiers to play outside with. One of the funniest things I remember is my Aunt Ginny, who lived with us on and off, made sandbags for our little soldiers that we made, and she used them for popcorn. Well, somehow or another, in the course of the winter and the summers and something, we'd lose these little sandbags, and we'd have corn growing all in any place in the yard where the corn came out. My brother and I were very busy children. I remember one neighbor who was building a house on the corner. We climbed all through the 2x4s when they were building that house. My poor mother almost had a heart attack with us. Some of the other things I remember, we were always having skin knees because we rode bikes everywhere. And if you didn't have scabs on both knees, you weren't trying very hard. When we went to school, we walked. There were no school buses. And yes, it was all uphill both ways. It really was. It was over a mile. Kindergarten, we went to Garnet School, which is a public school. And fortunately, I had a big brother. So when it was my turn to walk to kindergarten, he walked me up until we came to the main street. And then he went, when we started first grade, then we went to St. Angela's. So I went to Garnet School for kindergarten, and he was obviously in second grade at St. Angela's. But we walked together. And yes, it snowed a lot. And we were late for school a lot because we used to play in the snow walking to school. We lived in Cleveland until he was the end of his 5th grade, and I was in end of 3rd grade for me. my father got transferred. It was still during the war. Got transferred to St. Louis. But my mother was going to have a baby. Mary Ruth was coming. It was 1944. So Mary Ruth got born in February. We moved, my dad was working in St. Louis. We moved at the end of May. My dad and my father drove the family car to St. Louis. My mother and her 3-month-old baby and I took the train, and they drove to they met us at the train station, and then we lived in a suburb of St. Louis from 1944 until 1950. We just loved St. Louis. We loved Forest Park. We loved the summer musical outdoor operettas. We had veil prophet parades that we went to every year. St. Louis we just had a really good time in St. Louis. We picked up Cookie there. But it was just I don't know, it was just a fun city to live in. My brother and I went to St. Anne's, and then he went to St. Louis University High School, which is a Jesuit school, through his junior year. And I went to St. Joseph's Academy for my freshman year in high school. At the end of our freshman year and his junior year, my dad got transferred to Longview, Texas to start Mid-Valley Pipeline. It was tough on Ed, Teddy, and I because we were in high school. We moved to a rental home in this small town in Texas that had no central heat or air conditioning while our parents built a house. And we moved into a foreign country, Longview, Texas. We were Yankees, we were Catholic, and we were different. And I had to learn how to be a Southern girl, and I never quite understood it, you know. And segregation was very much going on in those days. And of course, when we lived in St. Louis, there were black people everywhere, but when we moved to Texas, they were invisible. So yeah, it was a whole different, what did I do? And when I was in high school, I learned to go to teas, I learned to go to luncheons, I learned to go on dances. And this is probably hard for you to understand, but if someone was giving you a luncheon in your honor, they let you out of school so you could go home and change your clothes so you'd be dressed appropriately for your luncheon. It was, like I said, a foreign country. It was so good to move back to Ohio to normal people. It was an interesting way of living. They never had the Depression in that part of Texas because oil came in the late 1920s and in the 30s. And so there were people that always worked. There were not homeless people down there. Yeah, oil was king in East Texas and West Texas. But like I said, it was a foreign country to move to. My mother tells the story about when we moved down there and she went to the newcomers meeting. What's your name? What does your husband do? And what church do you go to? And so um, that was the important things. Yes. I tried very hard as a teenager to learn how to be a Southern girl, but it just never worked. Ted did all right as a senior. He was kind of miserable. I mean, it's pretty hard to move when you're a senior in high school. I do remember this. He taught me how to drive. I wasn't 16, but you could drive younger than that in Texas, but my parents never knew. But we would, again, we were in a small town with no public transportation, so we had the family car that we had driven from St. Louis to Texas. So that's the one Teddy and I drove. My mother had another car at that point. The war was over. Besides Mary Ruth, we had picked up, Cookie got born in St. Louis. And then we moved to Texas, and we went to the Longview High School. It was a public high school. And we were Catholic. Turns out there were like 5 other people who were Catholic in the whole high school. The town had been a missionary Catholic place. And so I met my friend Tommy, and my brother and what turned out to be a boyfriend got to be good friends. My Aunt Ginny had left the Navy, gone to work, and she and her good friend moved to Texas after we did. And eventually, her friend decided to go back to Cleveland, so Ginny came and lived with us again. So, but I have to backtrack a little bit. In the meantime, my brother graduated from high school and went to Notre Dame and did not like it. Was not happy at all. So he came home and went in the Army. And we had these 2 little girls, Mary Ruth and Cookie. I was the babysitter. And he was gone to the Army. And then I went away to college. And then after my freshman year in college, my sister Margaret was born. And we got transferred. And so there my mother was with a 3-month-old baby again. And we moved to Lima, Ohio. I was in college in Indiana. My brother was in El Paso. And then he went to Korea. Because I remember going out to visit him at Fort Bliss and meeting your mother. He was just dating her. After he went in the Army and came back and got married and started having Frank and Ree and Paul, in the meantime, he went to Case Western Reserve, which is the college that my dad went to. And then he went to Ohio State, where he graduated, finally. And I think that's when Paul was born. I would have liked to have been an engineer. My father wouldn't allow me to do that because all you're going to do is get married and have babies. My father said, no, you won't get a job as a woman engineer. And I said, well, then I guess I'll be a teacher. So I did. But yay for Margie, she went on and became an engineer. People don't realize that when your mother and your father said this is what it's going to be, you did not discuss it. Unless you were Ted and you said, I'm going in the Army. My parents expected us to stand on our own 2 feet, and we did.